you're probably one of those people now that everyone looks back at and says, you predicted this at some point in the past. Like also Bill Gates predicted it, and everyone else, because you did that program in 2018. But this was going to happen, wasn't it? I mean, that was the premise of your program in 2018. This was going to happen at some point.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I can pretend that I was original and clever about the whole thing, but the reality is that there were countless experts. There was a whole chorus of experts who were screaming from the rooftops that this really was a matter of when, not if. If you just look at the number of times that viruses have jumped from other animals into humans, it's at a rate that's increasing. Spanish flu might have been 100 years ago, but there have been, even this century, SARS, MERS. There are swine flu, bird flu. I mean, these things are inevitable, and one that would slip through the net and end up being a pandemic. It was always coming.
Yeah, and I've heard it said that's because we are encroaching more on the natural habitats of creatures that we haven't maybe come across before. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very easy to try and blame China for this, and look at wet markets with a sort of Western haughtiness. But the reality is that actually, if we continue on this path of mass industrialized agriculture, taking land away from natural habitats and expecting the animals that we eat to live in very close proximity to exotic animals, I mean, we're really asking for trouble. It's just, I guess, bad luck that this time happened to be in a wet market in China rather than by another route.
So you tried to model how a pandemic might spread, and you used volunteers' mobile phones. So you tracked their location around the country. That's basically it, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly that. We wanted to essentially harvest people's data. We were very upfront about that from the get-go. We wanted the best picture that we could get of how people move around and how often they come into contact with other people. And so to do so, we did this big stunty TV thing where we pretended that a virtual pandemic would sweep through the UK.
And off the back of that, you get a model. Is that basically best kept as a list of coordinates for each phone, so over time, so then you can do whatever you want to that afterwards whenever you think of a new thing that you want to do with that information? Is that the best way to use those models?
I mean, so I think the best way to think of this is as though it's like Lego, right? You've got a model that tells you how a pandemic might spread through the country. The standard, they're called the SIR models, they call them. And plugging into that, you want the best possible description of where people go. Now, it may mean that you don't need to know exactly where people are at the level of an individual person. You might want a slightly more macro level view of the whole population, how the whole population generally move, or something that's broken down by age group or setting, that kind of thing. But it's the idea behind this data collection is that you're trying to replace the Lego brick that was in there before with the most accurate Lego brick that you can use.
But the idea, I suppose, is that if you are able to collect like really granular data, then in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, when we want to model something else, you have all the data ready to go, and you just say, right, now I want to model, whatever it is, commuter patterns or how the weather affects, or whatever it is, you want to store that data in as raw form as possible, I guess.
Exactly that. So when we did the programme, we did it as though it was a flu pandemic that was coming, influenza. And the reality is that it ended up being a coronavirus that has swept through. So it would have been a complete waste to set everything up so it's exactly perfectly tailored to an imaginary influenza pandemic, and then it will be worthless when coronavirus came along. So you want to keep as much as much room to maneuver as possible, so that you can make your models as adaptable as possible in the future.
So has that model contributed towards what we know about this pandemic? Is the government using the model that you created?
So not the model, but the data. So you have to. So these are the two bricks together, right? So we've got the data and then the simulation that we did in the program, and we stuck those two things together. So this bit over here, the simulation for the program, it's not completely worthless, but it sort of doesn't, it doesn't match up to the situation we're in now. But the data on the other hand, absolutely has plugged into the models that are being used first to model lockdown, but also to model what might happen when you start to ease lockdown.
Okay, so we'll talk about that in a second, but I just want to go back to January and February. Now, we first spoke in March, I think, and I asked you then, based on what you already knew, having done that program in 2018, when did you start to get worried? And was it any earlier than the rest of us were getting worried?
I think the people who understand exponential growth got worried a lot earlier than others. I was probably behind, in fact, I was behind a lot of the professional epidemiologists who I think really clocked on to the seriousness of this by late January. For me, it was, in fact, I remember exactly, it was the 25th of February, and it was the point at which we had domestic transmission in the UK, but we had no idea where that transmission had come from. It was actually when a case popped up in Haslemere in Surrey that I realised we were really in trouble, because if you've got domestic transmission that you're not on top of, then you have no idea how extensive it is. So I think for me that was the point where I really, really realised we were absolutely in trouble. There was no real stopping it.
I mean, I think I'm as guilty as any non-expert. I found myself thinking, well, we had SARS, we had MERS, but they didn't make it over here. So whatever they did in the East where SARS was, they'll probably do it again. So, I mean, SARS, the death toll in SARS wasn't very high at all, as I understand it, and they managed to stop it from coming to the rest of the world. Do you know why both those things happened?
Yeah, it all essentially comes down to a number, which is the number of cases that occur when the infected individual is pre-symptomatic. So the thing about SARS was that it was much more deadly than the current coronavirus that we're dealing with now. But you showed symptoms immediately. That the highest point of infection happened when you were showing symptoms, and so it meant that you could very easily spot who was contagious, who was infectious, isolate them, trace their contacts, and so on. But I think that there's a strange irony about the situation that we're in at the moment, which is that it's really that people don't feel unwell. That's the thing that makes this so deadly.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with one of the brilliant epidemiologists who told me about, in January they were at a meeting, a sort of infectious disease meeting, and some people from China.
By the way, just that sounds like something you don't want to go to, an infectious disease meeting. That sounds like a chicken's pox party.
It's true. They're always in like really exotic locations. So it's always like, oh yeah, I was at the conference in Tahiti. It's like, oh, that's how you tempt them out.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry. No,
it's fine. He told me that some of his colleagues who'd been working on the Chinese data had deliberately left their laptop open on the table and left the room so that other epidemiologists could look at the data. And he said that the one number that he saw that really frightened him, that he really realised that this was going to be very, very serious, was that 20% of the transmission was from pre-symptomatic individuals. So it's really that number that has made this so incredible, so different really from SARS and MERS, so difficult to contain.
Yeah, I spoke to the boss of Decode Genetics in Iceland, who we saw many years ago and who are now kind of at the forefront of looking at the genetics of the coronavirus. And he said most viruses over time evolve to become they spread easier, but they are less deadly, because if they were too deadly, they'd kill the host basically before they could spread it to other people. So those kind of viruses die out. But this, as you say, does both. Most people get it very mildly, so it's spread very easily, but it can also be deadly. So back to the model that you created. At the end of the program, you showed how, for example, hand washing can really slow down the spread of the pandemic. This is all to do with the R number. I know that the what is it? The reproduction number, is that what it's
Yeah,
All right.
reputational.
Okay. So I wonder how they kind of work out how different things affect the R number, like hand washing and then social distancing and closing various parts of society. Is that a mathematical thing, or is that a sociological thing that other people are called in to have a guess at?
Well, so it's kind of, it can be both. It can be both depending on the setting. So hand washing, as an example, is based on this idea that you're rolling the dice. Every time that you touch your face, every time you touch anything when you're out and about, you're rolling the dice. It might be that there's some infectious material, some virus on there that you then ingest. And what you're doing by washing your hands, 10 times a day or whatever, is you're just removing some of those dice rolls. So you can think of it as a very sort of back of the envelope calculation, but you can say, okay, let's say that if you wash your hands 10 times a day, you reduce your probability of getting the virus by 10%, right? I kind of made up that number, but they're roughly, that's roughly what we're talking about. And then you work it through. So if every single person has reduced their chance of getting the virus by 10%, then you can see the effect that has. And because these curves are exponential, it means that they have a massive effect. A tiny change can end up having a massive effect. For something like, let's say, children and closing schools, what you really need to understand to be able to work that through and see what effect that might have on the reproduction number, as an estimate this is, right? You're not measuring it, you're estimating it before it's happened. What you really need to understand is a few things. You need to understand what the probability of transmission is between kids, but you also need to understand how kids interact with other people in society. You need to understand who they see, how often they see them, in what settings they see them. And it's really only by having a very detailed understanding of those various things that you can work through the numbers.
So very early on, I think we were told officially that the evidence said closing schools would not reduce the curve, would not reduce the R number by that much. And, I've seen graphs that kind of show what the difference might be. And I've never understood that because, I've got two kids, one of them's at school, and I know how they interact. There's a lot of, you're not going to get them to socially distance at all. So do you have any idea why they would say that closing the schools doesn't have that much of an effect on the transmission?
Yeah, so it's a couple of things really. So for something like influenza, the kids have weaker immune systems than adults do. And so when it comes to something like influenza, actually kids end up being real drivers of the disease. They're more likely to get it. They're more likely to pass it on. They're more likely to be what's called the index case, which is the first individual in a household. They're the ones who are bringing the illness into the household. With this virus, it looks like it's the other way around, and there's still lots and lots that we don't understand about it, but it looks like it's the other way around. It looks like on various by various metrics, kids are less likely to be the main drivers of spreading the disease. So that's kind of part one. The second part, though, is that if you close schools, it's not like kids. I mean. They've still got to do something, right? They can't just this is closing schools when you're not in lockdown instantly. But they don't just you can't just lock them in a box and then just leave them to one side so they don't interact with anyone. And what ends up happening if you close schools is that kids maybe go and see their grandparents more, or kids maybe go and hang out in each other's houses more. And you have to think it's not about the net. It's not about the total impact that any of these interventions has that's important. It's about the marginal gains that you get by having them or not having them. So you have to offset what you gain by closing schools, say, with what you lose by then every kid going and seeing their grandparents because their parents are at work.
And is that in any way a mathematical calculation, or at that point are we in the realms of sociology? Can you put numbers on that sort of thing, or is that something that's more of a gut feeling?
Yeah, so these things are all. Oh gosh, I hope there's little gut feeling.
Well, as soon as I said that, I kind of regretted it because I know that gut feelings are often wrong. But what I mean is, is there any way of modelling mathematically what happens when you close schools and kids go and go around their friends' houses or go and see grandparents? Or is it a case of, at the very best, people say, well, I think 30% of kids are therefore going to mix with them, and 50% are going to go and stay with their grandparents while the parents work. How much can maths get in there, and how much is it like, or maybe they might do this, maybe they might do that, if you see what I mean?
So I think it's inevitably going to be both, right? We have a good understanding because of data like the data that we collected during that program. We have a good understanding of who kids interact with regularly, of what age groups they interact with outside of their own. So that's kind of gives us a good starting point. And then you can, from there, you sort of do have to do a bit of, okay, well, what's the percentage of this? What percentage will act in this way? What percentage will act in this way? You do have to make some assumptions. But generally speaking, the more that you break, you've got this gigantic problem of, okay, what difference is closing schools going to make? The more that you can break it down into smaller and smaller pieces, the better your overall estimate will become. But, I think that really underlines an incredibly important point about all of this, which is that these aren't crystal balls. These models aren't allowing you to look forward to the future and give you an absolute truth, right? These aren't the answers. They're totally wrapped in uncertainty in every possible direction. So you have to think of them as decision support tools rather than things that tell you the answer.
And the thing about these exponential curves is the slightest change in, for example, the R factor makes a massive difference, doesn't it?
Really
it's
does.
almost, it's so, I wouldn't want that job, because the difference between a 1.1 and a 1.2 or a 1 and a 0.9, they're massive differences, aren't they?
Yeah, they're gigantic, because it has this multiplicative effect, essentially. I think that we've definitely seen that countries that closed down earlier have ended up with far fewer people being, succumbing to the virus than we've had, here in Britain, for instance. And I think that the difference of locking down by a week essentially halves the numbers, right? It's just like, it's incredible that something that feels like it's such a small difference can end up, once it's worked its way through, just making having a massive impact.
So there's obviously going to be, and there are already questions being asked about why we didn't lock down earlier, but I know that's unfortunately, even that's not the only consideration, the number of deaths that might result from the coronavirus, because if you lock down for too long, there are other implications, aren't there?
There really are, yeah. So, we've seen this, I think, in the data already, that if you look at the excess deaths in the country, in Britain, which is the difference between the number of deaths that have happened and the number of deaths that you would expect for this time of year. If you look at those extra excess deaths, so the deaths where they've definitely happened, but COVID-19 is not mentioned on the death certificate, if those were all just underreporting, if that was all just people who were reluctant to put COVID-19 on the death certificate, or for whatever reason it wasn't being recorded as a death to the virus, then you would expect the gender split of those extra excess deaths to match the gender split of people who have definitely died from coronavirus, from COVID-19. Because actually, as we all know, coronavirus is disproportionately affecting men over women. Your risk as a man is round about twice that of a woman. So if you look in the extra excess deaths, you would expect to see that. You would expect to see many more men than women if they were all just underreporting. And that's not what you see. It's much closer to 50-50 than you would expect. And that suggests that actually we are seeing a huge number of people, potentially thousands of people each week, who are dying from this, from indirect effects of the lockdown rather than the virus itself. So people who aren't going to hospital when they have an accident, or people who perhaps have a heart attack and are reluctant to call an ambulance, all of those kind of things.
Yeah, and I guess mental health issues as well.
Yeah.
So you released a paper, you were named on a paper with other people, last week, I think, where you were talking about different measures and how they may or may not reduce this R number. And it said that just having a contact tracing app is not going to do the job. And also, even if you tested everyone in the country regularly, it wouldn't be enough to suppress the spread on its own. Can you explain what you found in that paper?
Yeah, so this is mainly work by my colleagues over at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where they use that data that we got from the BBC program and then plugged it into a new set of models. And essentially, I think the big conclusion from this paper is that when you run the numbers, there isn't some magical silver bullet. There is not one thing that we can just say, let's just do that, and then the whole country gets to go back to normal. There just isn't. There isn't something like that. You're going to have to layer up several interventions at once. So, for example, the app and take up on the Isle of Wight of this app has actually been pretty good, like much better, I think, than many people expected. But the thing is that the percentage of people who have to have the app before the probability that all of your secondary contacts, people you walk past in the street or sit next to on a bus, that all of your secondary contacts will also have the app. The number of people who have to have this downloaded onto their phones is so high before it makes a big dent in the reproduction number. So in the paper, for instance, the team assumed that, okay, let's say 3/4 of smartphone users will download this app. When you run through the numbers, that still gives you a reproduction number that's too high of over 1, something that would essentially return an uncontrolled epidemic if we all went back to normal.
Yeah, and also if we tested everyone in the country somehow, every 2 weeks, it still wouldn't arrest the spread. Is that right?
Yeah. So, this is a tricky thing because the way that this virus tends to progress when it's in a person is that it sort of is attacking your system for a few days, for 4 or 5 days before you show any symptoms. But one day before your symptoms arise, if you indeed end up having symptoms, you are infectious. You're capable of infecting other people. And then that period lasts for another few days, and then you will perhaps remain sick, but you're no longer a danger to others. You're no longer infectious. So all in all, you're talking about roughly 9 days, a 9-day window where you want to try and pick up on cases from testing and isolate these individuals to stop them from spreading the virus. Now, that sounds like loads, right? 9 days sounds like a 9-day period to catch someone. Sounds great. But once you run that through, essentially, it means that unless you're testing the entire population every single week, you are going to miss the vast majority of cases. So just as a sort of back of the envelope calculation, if you test the entire country every 2 weeks, half the country a week, seems like a big thing to aim for, but let's say that you do that, actually you'll only stop 65% of transmission because 45% of people, their 9-day window will fall within that 2 weeks, and they'll spread infections as though there were no testing program going on. The problem is, of course, testing half the population every week.
Yeah, that's impossible, isn't it? This is why I suspect it's really important to hit this early, because the number of cases that you have to test and the number of contacts you have to trace there are manageable, and it's as soon as it gets into the thousands, I imagine it's game over for contact tracing. Is it?
Well, contact tracing is certainly it's definitely effective, but it's a lot easier when the numbers that you're handling are smaller.
Yeah.
But I think I'm not against, just to be clear, I still think that testing is going to be an incredibly important part of the way forward. It's just we're going to have to layer up a few different things.
And so you said that the countries that really prevented the deaths were the ones that locked down earlier. The R number itself is dependent, am I right, on both what's going on in society, schools open, closed, lockdown, whatever, but also the nature of the virus. Is that right? That different viruses have different infection rates. And I'm wondering whether, I heard, I think last week, they think the R number in London might be as low as 0.4 as of last week. And I'm wondering how they can know that when we're not testing everyone anyway. That seems a pretty accurate number. What do you think that's based on?
So there's very clever things that you can do. So the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine are really forging ahead with this and leading the way, which I think is super impressive. So what you can do is you can look at other data sources. So you can look at things like Facebook data or Google data or mobile phone data, and from that you can infer how people are moving around,
Right.
and you can calculate an estimate. And of course, it will be wrapped in uncertainty, but you can calculate an estimate for what the reproduction number might be based on that data. There are other ways, of course. You can interview people about how many times they're coming into contact with others, but it's something that you can get at without necessarily needing to wait the 3 weeks before the death figures are registered.
I read somewhere or I saw a video or something where the quote was, "This is why mathematicians get paid a lot of money to make these as accurate as possible." Now, I reckon not all of that statement is actually true, but is it right that the real art in the science, if you like, is getting those estimates through the maths as accurate as possible? Is that where we are with this discipline of maths at the moment?
Yes, I think we are, but I also think that you need to manage your own expectations, not just about the salaries that mathematicians might be able to earn, but also about just how much uncertainty there is in these things.
Yeah.
Because I think just across the board, right, with models, with data, with estimates of the reproduction number, you cannot think of this stuff as though they are cold hard facts, because they're not. They're never going to be. You have to think of them as a guiding hand through the darkness, right? That may or may not be leading you in the right direction.
But getting that uncertainty down, I suppose, is what I'm getting at. Because if the difference is massive when the parameters change ever so slightly, then it's reducing that uncertainty as much as possible, I'm guessing.
But you'll never be able to get rid of it. You'll never be able to get rid of it.
Yeah.
You just got to manage it as best you can.
So back in March, the Imperial College released a paper which it seems changed the government's mind, and we went into lockdown very soon after that. It made for quite depressing reading when I try reading it late at night. That seemed to suggest, well, first of all, that we were going to massively overwhelm the NHS if we didn't lock down. But also it suggested that we were going to need periods of lockdown until we find a vaccine. So we're going to be in and out of lockdown for the next 12 or 18 months in order that the number of cases will build up when we ease the lockdown, and then we'll lock down until the cases die off again. What did you think of that paper, and do you think it's still relevant?
Yes, I do think it's still relevant. So I think the first thing to say is that they weren't alone. I mean, there were I think a number of groups were looking at similar things at the same time. So I think that there's been a lot of people who've attacked that particular paper, found fault with that particular paper, and I don't buy into it that much, because I think that there were other groups that were saying similar things. You have to think of it as it's the big picture rather than necessarily the exact numbers. So I think one of the things that's important to say about that idea of successive lockdowns is that it was assuming that we opened up completely in the interim. And I think that what's changed since then is this idea of trying to find some balance of society where we can open up enough that we can carry on with our lives, but keep closed enough that the virus doesn't end up spreading in an uncontrolled way again. I mean, the thing is that no one, when that paper was released, no one even knew that Western style lockdowns would work, right? So that paper was essentially making, as it had to, was essentially making guesses about what the impact that a lockdown would be on R. And actually, as it's turned out, the lockdown has worked, and we have a little tiny bit of wiggle room where we can just open up slightly.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about something else?
Yeah, go on.